tell you I'm very, very pleased and also honored to be here. Um, and of course, I'm pleased to meet with my colleagues from the Federal University of Para, but I'm even more pleased, I have to tell you, to meet with the students because our life is not for our colleagues, it's for the students. So we're here for the students. So I'm very happy that so many of you are here, and I really hope that we can have a nice afternoon together. Normally, what I like, and also that holds for this afternoon, is I like to communicate with the students. So I'm not a teacher that says it's true, is not true. I like to get some wisdom back. Now and then I will ask you some questions. So, in this way, we can collectively develop some new ideas. And so on. But before doing so, and before starting, I would like to give a small present. I have here recovered from disasters, and that has to do with a broader research nowadays in the economics discipline, but also in other social sciences, i.e., resilience. So, if that shock, what will happen after the shock? And my presentation this afternoon is indeed on is the shock good for you? But before doing so, we have recently done a book, which also Rima Kutic, one of my colleagues from the Netherlands, has participated. It's called Resilience and Regional Development. I would like to offer this as a gift for the university library so that all of you can also study this. So, yeah, okay, good. So, all of you can study this book and then you get wisdom on the question we have here: is a shock good for you? Well, is a shock good for you? If you get a shock, is that good for you or not? Yeah? Or is it if a disaster happens, is that good for you? I don't know. I think it can be very good because, and now I go back to one of the well known teachers and professors in economics, Schumpeter. And Schumpeter has developed the concept of what he called creative destruction. If you want to make progress, first you have to destroy all the old things, and you can build something new, something creative. We call the creative destruction. Now that old system of Schumpeter is still valid in our time because it is not only hold for business life. So if the firm goes bankrupt, some creative destruction, firm disappears, we get new firms that we call creative destruction, but have many other things in our economies, in our world, where things for some reason are destroyed. And of course, you could argue it's not very good for me, but I'm more the optimist. And I would like to advocate this afternoon a more challenging proposition under certain conditions. A shock, a disaster can be very good. But of course, any economist knows you have to prove this. No one should believe me or your honorable professor, etc., unless you can. If you can prove it, we have to believe it. Find it on facts. No facts, we cannot believe. If there are facts, we can believe. So now the question I have here actually is on a question which has to do with shocks, disturbances, disasters, catastrophes, and if they happen, is that good or bad? I'm sure you would say, well, um, if there is a shock, let's say an earthquake or a hurricane, is not so good, right? Good, but you might get stronger because you can think, how can I, if an earthquake or a hurricane has happened, what is my response? And maybe in the future I can do it. So I would like to advocate this afternoon very challenging proposition. The shock can be very good, very good. It wakes you up. That is Schumpeter, creative destruction, and you will do better. So this is the question I would like to discuss with you. There are many, many examples. I will start a simple example. Several years back, we had a severe earthquake in Haiti, and a big disaster, many people killed. If you go to Haiti nowadays, or to France, it's still a disaster. And so the response after the earthquake was a response cannot do very much. The government was very weak, corruption, and many things, and nothing happened. Let me take another example. An earthquake in Japan, in Kobe, also several years ago. And Kobe was hit by an even worse earthquake than Haiti, but the Japanese, they became immediately very active, rebuilt the city, built better infrastructure, a better port, better houses, and the city of Kobe now is flourishing more than ever before. So we get the same uh, loss, i.e., an earthquake. In some cases, it's a disaster. In other cases, it can be a blessing, right? So, under which conditions then is something a blessing? Under which condition is something a catastrophe? So that's the question here. Blessing in disguise. Disguise means very terrible. Be always under certain conditions, of course, and we have to find out under which conditions it's true or not. So that's a little bit the challenging story I would like to discuss with you this afternoon. Let's start with an old historical example. In the year 1421, so many years back, more than 600 years ago, a major storm and flood came from northern part of Europe, going into the North Sea, and wiped out a significant part of all the countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of Germany, and of course, as some of you may know, these are the low countries underneath sea level. So if you get a big storm, everything was so the whole country was almost flooded. Thousands of people killed, nothing left. And then you might say, well, we don't like that. Yeah, I agree. We don't like floods. We don't like disasters. But what happened? Decades later, one of the central cities in that area, Dordrecht, became the center of the Netherlands. And built it up again, and in 20, 30, 40 years' time, it was again a flourishing trade city, starting international trade over the sea. So very well in the long run for the area which was affected by a major storm. But it did not come automatic. You have to be active. That's also the lesson of Schumpeter, creative destruction. But creative, it means you have to be creative, otherwise, not the winner. So this is more or less the lesson we have here. By the way, some of you wonder why this major flood. This is a painting was made. But this is called the Elizabeth flood. It is called the Elizabeth flood because it happened 18th and 19th of November, and that is the name day of Saint Elizabeth. So that's why it was called the Elizabeth flood. Um, so yeah, that is a positive example where a flood in the longer run can be positive. And for an economist, of course, it's important to know what does it mean if it is positive? How much time do we need in order to cover and so on? So this is an interesting, let's say, issue which nowadays is becoming more and more important also in the economics literature. Because economics used to think in terms of demand and supply, in terms of responses of actors, and in terms then of an equilibrium. Equilibrium theory is one of the fundamental principles of economics. But nowadays, the question is, what is then an equilibrium if there is a shock? Not only an earthquake, it can be many natural disasters, no, but of course, in recent years, we have had also other shocks. Migration crisis, major shock in many countries, maybe less so in Brazil, but in Europe and also in Africa, migration shock, in a major disturbance of the economy. And the question again is migration good or bad for a city, right? And the question is always here, there's the short term, there's the long term. The short term, the shock, of course, that was your first reaction. The short term shock is not very pleasant. But in the longer term, it might, of course, be more favorable. And so if we make the distinction short and longer term, we have to recognize short term, there is human suffering. If there is an earthquake or a war, that's, of course, a lot of human suffering. My question is on the short term suffering of the people and much more on the longer term perspective. What will happen? And will there be a new equilibrium? So we get a shock in the system. That could be firms going bankrupt, a banking crisis, a financial crisis. We have had all kinds of crises in the past years. We've had the corona crisis. Rima later on will give a presentation for more corona crisis. What does it mean? And is it good or bad in the longer run? And of course, nowadays, a war situation, at least in the other part of the world, the Latin America, might be more safe. Of course, we have the war in the back garden of Europe, Ukraine, Russia. We have nowadays, in the past 2 weeks, the war of Israel against Gaza Strip, which of course takes the life of many people. And the question is always, is that good or bad? In the short run, it's bad. And maybe a war is never good. But if it happens, what then will be the consequence? Now, in a recent study, you find it's just been published in a journal called Socioeconomic Planning Sciences. Rima Kuti and myself and a few others have been looking into the question, the theory of shocks. Uh, if a shock occurs in an economic system, there will be a first short-term, of course, decline. But in the longer run, and we try to come up and test the proposition that in the longer run, shock can be favorable for the economy, but of course, under conditions of a good government and a good response. That's why I mentioned the example of Haiti. Haiti, no good response, nothing happened. But in Japan, immediately a good government response. In the longer run, it's even better. So, and now we have to find out, can we empirically demonstrate this? Can we develop a theory, a methodology? Can we then prove this by using empirical techniques? Or we have to believe the facts. So that's you for today. And as I said already before, that's what we call the blessing in disguise. Disguise is terrible, but we can make it a blessing. That is, of course, the optimism maybe we might have and need to have in our current. So underneath of the slide, you find a few examples. Um, there is a well-known article published some 8 years ago on the what was called by the author the effects of the strategic bombing of German cities during the war. As you know, during the war, Britain, England, what especially Britain did is not only to attack the enemy, the army, but also every night sending bombers to Germany, destroying German cities. Whether we like it or not, but that has happened. Not military targets, civil targets. Every night, German cities were bombed until they were completely destroyed. Dresden, Leipzig, Köln, Frankfurt, all the cities. So that Germany had to surrender, not only military, also because the civil attacks. Exactly the same, of course. We see the Russian attacks on Ukraine. We see the Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip. It's not only military purpose, civil purpose, whether we like it or not. It's a tragic fact of our life, perhaps. And now several researchers have tried to find out what has happened with the German cities which were bombed during the war and those cities which were not bombed during the war. So we have some sort of a natural experiment. Cities bombed, cities not bombed. And then 50 years later, 70 years later, you can make a comparison. Which cities were performing better? The cities which were bombed or the cities which were not bombed? Now, interesting enough, in this study, it was not our study, but a study by other colleagues, it turned out that those German cities which were destroyed during the war, they performed better than those which were not attacked by the British. And of course, first you are surprised. But if you think about it, it makes sense to come to that conclusion because those cities which were destroyed had to rebuild the whole infrastructure, etc. So if you go to a city like Düsseldorf or Dresden or Frankfurt, after the war, they had to rebuild the cities. They built wide, etc. These were much more accessible to transport. So it made the cities much more accessible and more favorable for economic development. So these German cities, they did very well. The others had narrow streets, difficult to attract new activities, etc. So the conclusion was essentially that in the longer run, the shock, that was my question, shock, it was a shock to a city, uh, in fact, helped the German cities to recover. So that's an important point. Different examples. And more recently, let me take the last one, New Orleans. I guess all of you are familiar with Hurricane Katrina, which was a terrible hurricane. It destroyed a significant part of New Orleans. And I don't know whether some of you have been in New Orleans, but New Orleans before the hurricane beautiful, with a nice mixture of different cultures, and it still had its connection to water, also music, so every all over the city. Very nice, vivid city. Suddenly, the hurricane wiped out everything. People left, and as we know, Americans are very mobile, more mobile than other people. So many the city was almost empty. But now, if you're now back in New Orleans, you'll see that people have come back. New hotels have been built, and gradually, old atmosphere is coming back, but doing much better, more modern. So, in the longer run, New Orleans will be better off compared to the situation in the pre-hurricane period. So, we have several examples worldwide where a catastrophe can be helped. I would not say in human terms, but economic terms, economics, economic terms, a catastrophe is not necessarily forever a catastrophe. So that's in fact my challenging position, which I would like to advocate to you. This. One of the more modern elements, which is often being used also not only in Japan, for instance, also in China, and is the idea there in the catastrophe, like an earthquake, hmm, building back better. This means not only building back, but building better. And that's in fact what has happened in several cities, regions, countries affected by a catastrophe. After things were destroyed, you could improve things, which otherwise you would not have done. So this idea of BBB or triple B, building back better, is an important lesson because we need to be better. Essentially, want to not only go back to the original equilibrium of the system in terms of systems and community, you want to improve the world. So building back nowadays is an important element. It's difficult, as we know. The recent earthquake in Turkey just a few months ago and in Morocco, it how difficult it is. And, so it means a lot of more, much more actionable activities from governments compared to the stable economic situation. Uh, and we also have to appreciate how difficult this can be. Just give you one example, an example in which we have been involved ourselves. The war in Ukraine with a terrible destruction of many cities. And the city of Mariupol, for instance, completely destroyed in the fights between the Russian army and the Ukrainians. City completely destroyed. And the only thing people want to have is, I need a house. Yeah, some of you may be familiar with economic jargon of Maslow. Housing is very high on the hierarchy of Maslow. So people always want to have a house. If you don't have a house, then you're always in a problem. So what we see in Ukraine, after cities were destroyed because of the Russian bombardment, people wanted to do, I need a house. I want to rebuild a house. And if you go to Bangladesh, after a flood in Bangladesh, first thing people make, I want to build my problem there is that this is a valid response. But if you rebuild exactly the same house, you're still vulnerable and you have not improved the situation. So the main question is not only back, but building back better. And some of the visits we have paid to Ukraine in the past was mainly on the discussion. What would you need in order to improve the situation? The direct response is give me a house, but in the longer run, it is important to say, well, it's better to have a house which is energy efficient. So these are some of the challenges also from a policy perspective. Um, on this part, I just would like to draw attention to a book, an important book, which was written by a German quantitative sociologist, Ulrich Beck. If you look at the internet, you find his name. If you Google, you find him immediately, Ulrich Beck. And he wrote a very interesting book on the risk society. So in modern times, there is not a stable equilibrium is some fragile, it can change, and there's always a risk and a threat, disturbances. So it questions a little bit our, let's say, standard view on there be an equilibrium. Is there always an equilibrium? Or might it be that we have a series of disequilibrium forces, whether this is a financial crisis, a banking crisis, a migration crisis, a corona crisis, a war crisis, a natural disaster crisis, all kinds of crises. So economics question is the average fluctuation more or less stable, or can we maybe, hopefully, make the best out of all these fluctuating movements that go up a higher level? This is more or less the question which nowadays economic policy is seen as one of the most important questions. And so that has to do with the risk society idea. Economists have to study more risk than ever, the uncertainties forward. The question is, disasters might be or can be opportunities, but opportunities never are there automatically. Some of you may be familiar with the biblical expression manna from heaven. Israel in the past desert, but nowadays, so you have to work on it. Businessmen, but also governments are not working on it, then nothing will happen. So opportunities have to be created. They are not there automatic. Just like playing football, play football, you have to create the chances. If you do not create the chances, you will never score. You have to create the chances, then you might score. The same, in fact, economy, opportunities, even when things are difficult, create opportunities, and then you might be lucky. Does not mean by definition you will score, but if you never create opportunities, you will not score, never win at football match. That is in fact also the same here in the economy. As I said before, there are short-term and there are long-term elements, and they also are because they went a little bit too. No, it's It blocked, but that's okay. So it's a short term and a long term. But now you are smart. I tell you, things might be better. You have to ask the question, what is better? And in traditional economic computation, we might say, well, we can measure progress, we can measure economic growth by looking into GDP, gross domestic product. That's very often the standard measure of many economies. Gradually, in the past years, the past decade, more or less we have come to the conclusion that if you would say better means GDP, it's a rather limited perspective. And all over the world, there have been a lot of studies on can we have different measures for what is better, not only GDP, but also maybe other measures. That started already several years ago when people were talking about economic growth and environmental decay. The environment is polluted. We grow in economic terms, but the environment is terrible. So, in fact, the question was then, can we correct GDP for the destruction of the environment? Right? So that was then called green GDP. It's still a well-known term in the literature, green GDP, or sometimes called uh, beyond GDP, etc. But these are the terms you often in the economic literature. But then, of course, it's not only a matter of and the other elements. So, United Nations then, over the past decade, tried to come up with a better welfare measure, not but also other elements which help of the people. And what you find what you find here is, of course, how it is, yeah. But now it is blocked. No, here we are. Oops. Okay, sorry, not totally synchronized. Yeah, back to this. Um, no, no, maybe you better. Can you one more? One more? Yeah, and it goes too fast. Okay, good. I don't know why. Doesn't matter. On the right-hand side, you have what we call standard of living. So that is GNP, gross national income per capita, etc. Standard. But the person, do you feel better after a catastrophe? It's not only income, health. Nowadays, also in the context of developing countries, health, we have lots of health. We know that the life expectancy of people differs enormously, not only between countries, health expectancy of people in India, which might be between 60 or 70 years, compared to 70, 80, 85 years in most of the OECD. Big difference. It even goes further, even within a city. And I'm sure Belém will have the same phenomenon because I know it from a city well in the Netherlands. That if I go in Rotterdam, take the metro, I go from the northern part to the southern part, only 7 miles. 7 miles. I can go by metro. The northern part is the rich part. Clean, nice villas, rich people. They go across the river, underneath the river, end up in the southern part of Rotterdam. Old housing, terrible neighborhoods, criminality, drugs, very much a multicultural system with people from all over the world clustering in the house. The life expectancy of people living in that area compared to the life expectancy in the northern part, the life expectancy has a difference of about 7 years. 7 years in one the same city. We live up north, life expectancy 7 years higher than in the south. So you have, and that's seven, so that's why we call the 7 miles principle. Every mile you go further south, you lose 1 year of average life expectancy. So that means that it's not only income which counts. Life are you better off? Health is very important. What are we doing to create knowledge, right? And that's the best thing we can do. That's why universities should privilege. That's why government should attend to that knowledge is something which, in the longer run, always pays off. Better people, better medical knowledge, but also social knowledge, technological knowledge. Knowledge is one of the, it's almost like a miracle. It creates its own dynamics. So also in United Nations statistics, what is then called the HDI, the Human Development Index, we find there in education and knowledge as an important element. Then I have to tell you one, because universities sometimes have not always been very good in this. We have some universities where only the rich people. Harvard in Cambridge, United States, need to have your parents have to pay to Harvard because the fees are so high, no one can pay for it. So you get a social discrimination, and that's why I personally think that it's not only investment in knowledge which is important, but knowledge also the ones who come from poor families. They deserve to have. I was told, I think, someone told me also here in the university, special fund or whatever, also to support people from poorer families. I think it's really nice. And personally came from a poor family, so I know what it means if knowledge. So the best thing a government can do is invest in knowledge in universities, and teachers have to make sure that we get good students. That's our task. Yeah. So all in all, if we are talking about is it good or bad after a catastrophe, it's not only it is of course health and health investments, medical systems, access to hospitals and so on. It's also schooling. I think is excessively important. So yeah. Now I'll just use a side excursion on the theory because what I what we develop is the following. If you want to produce the what we call the HDI, so the human development, it's almost like as we know this in economics from production. See, economics we have production. factory by a smart combination of capital and labor and technology, etc., etc. Same extent, HDI, that's the output arm stock, is it doesn't fall from heaven, so not the manna from heaven. No, you can produce it by something which over the past years has been called territorial capital. Territorial capital has been introduced, amongst others, by OECD. Major concept where it says if you have good territorial capital, then you can do much better. So create good capital, not only financial, territorial capital, I do better. And here, the theory we have developed a little bit is the following. Of course, any economist knows we have economic capital. Of course, that's quite evident. But we also might have ecological resources, clean environment, that's very important for the productivity and the efficiency of any country. Stated in several studies. Of course, we have advanced technological systems, um, biotechnology, digital technology, nanotechnology, all the other things. And of course, that's also important. You need geographical infrastructure, of course, advanced roads, airports, ports, logistics. You need also the social superstructure because if people live in a nice environment, it immediately increases their productivity. So social capital is also an important element of the whole complex of territorial capital. So now we have five factors: economics, ecological, technological, geographical, and social. And that's what we have put here together in what we call the Pentagon model because it has these are the five. So, and in addition to the standard economic wisdom of having a simple production function, neoclassical economics and what have you, here we have a more generalized theory, and that, of course, that combination of five forms of capital then would lead us to a higher efficiency. In the center of this pentagon, you find the term XXQ. What is XXQ? Q, you can imagine, stands for quality. Quality is not only the economy, it's human health. So Q, but what is XXQ? You should know if you go to a shop, right? You want to buy clothes, yeah? And if you end up with XXL or whatever, get right. XX is the biggest size if you buy clothes. The same here. XXQ means the highest quality you can get, right? So that's an analogy to normal shopping behavior. And, so an XXQ is in fact the outcome nation of five factors in the pentagon. So that's a little bit the theory we have adopted. And then now we go back to our management. Here you find it. On the left-hand side, the red box, conflict, shock, disaster, whatever. Then do not read it, but it stands for infrastructure, income and profits, production, transport, and people, etc. So it goes gradually down. And what you see build environment is the first one affected by a shock. Um, some of you may, of course, know about the war. Ukraine, what was the first thing the Russians did in attacking Ukraine? Destroy the infrastructure. And the built environment, certainly the energy infrastructure. It's almost a repetition nowadays. The Gaza Strip, uh, big problems because there is no electricity, there is no public transport anymore, and of course that leads to a enormous dip in the economic performance of a country. I'm giving a value judgment, but these are the economic facts we have to envisage. So this is the shock effect, and then at the end you go down, and you can either stay down on uh, this U-shaped curve, in fact Haiti, hmm, or you can say, well, so can improve. Then you can start reconstruction efforts, business, trade, welfare, sustainable development, income, profits. And then you end up green side. This means more resilience, better performance. And if you are really very good, of course, the recovery might go up. And then you get what we already discussed before. You might be better off at the end, but only when there is a good government. Otherwise, it will not work. So it's also part of what we found out. Very important. So the test we are doing here essentially is find some data, find out whether in many cases this proposition shaped curve, which might end up higher than before, is valid or not. Um, yeah, here, as we know, economists believe in facts. Of course, we need theory, but we also need facts. Otherwise, we cannot believe what we are. But in this particular case, there are cases all over the world of catastrophes. Natural catastrophes, human-made catastrophes, technological catastrophes. Over the past 30 years, they have been rather well documented. Not only which type of catastrophe, country, time, etc., but also the size. How many people were killed? How many people were injured? What was the economic effect? The cost, damage cost, etc. Say all these things, very reliable. But if you have hundreds of these documented data on catastrophes, you get a rather good picture. So it means we can more or less rely on all these data. So they can rely on all these databases and so on. That brings me to the next step, in fact, the theoretical framing which we have adopted. Start here on the left-hand side with a natural disaster. And of course, you get immediate impact, the instantaneous impact. Then, of course, you get a response. What kind of response? And then I think I said before the Pentagon model, because that is territorial capital, which is necessary in order to create a recovery of the system. So the blue Pentagon model, the lower side, you go through it back into the system, and then you get an effective policy response. Again, if you are very active, you get a very effective response. One country that can show you the figures later on, one country which is very effective in terms of response mechanisms is China. China is the country with by far the most natural catastrophes in the world. The country has many natural catastrophes, floods, many of them every year, etc. Earthquakes. And so Chinese have learned to be very responsive. It has not very much affected the economy of China, despite all the disasters. Why? because they have organized a territorial capital in a very professional way that led to policy response, long-run social impact, not only GDP, but also well-being and HDI, human development, etc., would play a role. And at the end, then you get on the right-hand side, you get a blessing in disguise. Are we better off or not compared to zero situation? Yeah. So this is the model we have used. So here you have the HDI. HDI is the output, and it can be explained by human capital and all the other database. And then, with the help of a whole group of researchers, have been working on the question: can we find a correlation for those countries, regions, cities which have been affected by a catastrophe? Can we find a relationship so that we can prove that a proper response to a catastrophe in the longer run, could be after 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, would lead to a more favorable outcome? So this has been the statistical econometric exercise we have been undertaking in the past years. That several publications have shown one of them. And the result we more or less got, looking at all kinds of technicalities, correlation analysis, modeling, etc., etc., more or less led us to the result. Go quickly to here. This is part of the mapping. That indeed, in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, there is a confirmation of the hypothesis from an economic and human development perspective. In many cases, a catastrophe was in the long run favorable for the country or the region, whatever unit you have chosen. But of course, there's a lot of variety because the catastrophe is discriminating among countries, among time periods, etc. Here, for instance, top find type of catastrophes like earthquakes and floods and storms and droughts and have you. And then you get on the right hand side this subdivision to Asia, Africa, the Americas, Europe, and Oceania, for instance. And here you find the question of which categories, high income, low income, middle income, etc., etc. And there are a couple of interesting observations. Europe, apparently from the perspective of natural disasters, is rather safe. So in brown, no, yellow part is very low, and Africa is much higher, and Asia is also is in fact the highest. If you look into the income categories, you find the same. But at the same time, we have to look critically into such findings because if, let's say, a flood occurs in, say, Texas, United States, compared to the same flood in Bangladesh, the cost is the same flood, the same number of people affected, but the cost in Texas are higher than the cost in Bangladesh. and that has to do with the way economists measure statistics. Because a human life, it would measure human life, there are all statistics on the measurement of the value of human life, value of human life. A human life in the American system has a higher value in, in dollar terms than a human life in Bangladesh. Financially, I'm not talking about the emotional value, that is not something economists can measure productive contribution. The same for infrastructure. Infrastructure in a Western country, United States, also Europe, maybe partly Brazil, some states at least, is much more costly than infrastructure in Bangladesh or India. So we have the same level of destruction, the same loss of people, but for India or Bangladesh, sounds less. And that is of aim that it would be the same. So where economists still, I think, have a long way to go, how to include the level of development in their accounting statistics. That's something where also the World Bank has said not yet has come up with very clear directives. But so there's also a research which all of us. Yes, I would like to well, continue just quickly, and then because we have some discussion, we did all the correlation and etc. And that continues, and there are many many slides. We can share them with you if you can leave them and send them to you or whatever, and they can you can because give you knowledge, so you can get everything. Uh, but what is the overall conclusion? The overall conclusion essentially is, of course, all the elements of territorial capital. But the most important, effective element is actionable governance. Actionable, solid governance. And that has to do with two things, maybe three, but certainly two. First, the immediate response after a catastrophe. And second, the strategic view on where you want to be. Maybe third, the preventive action. Now let me start with the first one, the immediate action. If there is a flood, a volcanic eruption, whatever, a big forest fire, and also Brazil increasingly gets more forest fires than in the past. So that's an issue. First question is always, if it happens, who is responsible for the action? And it ought to be known before the catastrophe happens. If it happens, then if a governor or state minister or a fireman or the police army have to discuss what shall we do in charge, it's already too late. So that's one of the first things we have learned also in many OECD countries. Each type of catastrophe of a certain size, you can have all classifications. It ought to be known immediately if things happen that in 1 second, by law, this and this person, this and this functionary is responsible for all the actions to coordinate things, getting count different agencies who all think is very important. That's number one. Number two is the, let's say, the long run strategic perspective. Rather than being paralyzed by the catastrophe, good governance means immediately having a strategy in mind so that you can look forward, because that creates blessing in disguise principle. Make the best out of any catastrophe. That's the lesson, in fact. There's a blessing in disguise. So that's also important. Good governance means, especially, you are a good governor in case of a catastrophe. catastrophe. If there is no problem, you don't need it. But good government are needed when there's a problem. So that's lesson two. And lesson three is also an important one, and that goes back to the theory of Ulrich risk society theory. To deal with risks, our modern economies, whatever the risk may be, means try to prevent shock. There is a famous statement of Albert Einstein, the well-known Albert Einstein, where he says a um, a good policymaker can handle a problem, but the best policymaker makes sure there is no problem. Right? So preventive policy is important, and that requires a lot of public funding because nothing goes itself. If you one small example from my own country, the Netherlands, small country, much smaller than Brazil, small country. Uh, One of the major challenges we have all the time is the water, flooding, sea, rivers, especially nowadays, climate change and rising sea level, of course. Many of us are below this. For instance, my own house, close to the coast, 5 meters below. So if the dike breaks, I can tell you, I would like to come back to Berlin, but I cannot. I will not come back to Berlin because it's too late. So we have to avoid that the dikes break, and that holds for many things. That holds for in terms of prevention measures. But from a financial economic perspective, prevention is very difficult for two reasons. It's costly, and second, people might say, well, we have not had any disaster over 20 years. Why should we spend so much money? Because nothing has happened, and we spend all the money. And that's, of course, from a policy and economic perspective, the most challenging question. Can we convince the people that it's always good to invest in prevention? Very difficult because we know that also our parliaments, they like to spend the money on beautiful things and prevention. Simple example, in Europe at least, almost all European countries in the past 20, 30 years have reduced their military budget. Of course, there was no war. We were even great friends with Russia, etc. So why should we invest so much money in the now suddenly there's war? Now all the countries have significantly increased their military budgets, not only 1 or 2%, up to 50% enormous volumes of money, because suddenly you realize a war, rather than being involved in a war, is better to prevent the war. So this, in fact, Albert Einstein, the excellent policy maker, prevents the problem, solves the problem, but prevents it. Okay, so having said this, I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much. Now we need questions. Who would- Yeah, question. Yeah? Okay. Yeah, okay. Microphone to you. I can hear
First of all, nice to meet you, Professor. It's an honor to uh, watch your lecture. Even though I came in a little after it has already started. But my question is regarding the Schumpeter economic theory. How do you think we can apply it to underdeveloped countries? Because, well, when I think that the basis for the Schumpeter theory is that economic development comes from technological innovation. How can we be able to do this in underdeveloped countries where the where how can we do this in underdeveloped countries in which the entrepreneurs are sort of fragile uh, and in comparison to the government.
Okay, well, I like that question. It's a more general question, but nevertheless, I think it's a very important question because um, Peter, seeing that you want to make progress, you need to make some sort of a quantum jump. Otherwise, you will always stay where you are. And I will give you one example, I think, of a good Schumpeterian phenomenon, the situation in China. If you were in China 30, 40 years ago, it was very much an underdeveloped country, very much, not only peripheral part of China, but even in the major cities, Beijing, Shanghai, then and what have you. The Chinese government has done one important thing. It has said, even when we are rather poor, we will invest in our future. The public budget in China is formidable. Uh, a strong governance. That's a matter of views on democracy, of course, and we know might have some questions there. That's not this argument. But at the same time, if we stay only with, let's say, low quality products, we will never conquer the world market. And what China is, we have been there several times in the past years, investing heavily in new knowledge, good universities, best university in the world you can find in China nowadays, uh, a enormous stimulus for the private sector, big business, and formidable things. It's unbelievable. Firm, big firm in China, unbelievable what they are able to. They try to make this quantum jump, starting from, let's say, cheap products, which are not, well, are competitive in price, but nothing special, toward high quality products. Whether we like it or not, China is going to be a major electric cars now being built in are at least as good as ones Tesla produced, some far cheap and more advanced. China is now building up its own line and airplane industry. All over the world, we only have three bigger airline companies. That's Boeing, there's Airbus, here, which is based in country. It's a very nice airplane, short distances, etc. It's a good airplane. So that's three, maybe four bombers. In 5 to 10 years' time, China will also be a major world player. That's a very sophisticated technology. So gradually, what they do, they heavily in new technology. Firms are only respected business with normal things. You ought to be better than last year. Building back better. You always have to be better, and that's the one of the miracles of the Chinese study and economic books, economic miracles in China. Main question, main answer given, in fact, is always all want to win. They want to be their genes, their DNA. We want to be better, and I think that is one of the miracles. So you should question, yes, of course, also any shock, economic or technological disaster, China would always come back and come back better. So there is an important lesson in several countries now. For your question.
Well, I would also like to thank you very much for your presentation. I think it's an honor not only for me, but for all of us here to have the opportunity to watch such a good presentation. And my question will start from your last answer about China. I'm also very interested about China catch up in these recent 40 years. Because I mean, when you think about Brazil compared to China, during the 80s, we exported more than China and South Korea together. And now look at the present situation. And starting from this Schumpeterian point of view, my first question is, how would Schumpeter interpret the Chinese catch up in in these late 40 years? How would how was China able to build this Pentagon infrastructure in order to um, strengthen itself so they can respond immediately and effectively to almost every kind of crisis? And my second question is about Brazil and especially Amazon. When it comes to financial or, I mean, a typical capitalist crisis, it's kind of easy to think that we can build some uh, infrastructure to respond to it, right? Like social infrastructure, capital, labor. I mean, if you have all these factors, it's a question of governance, like you said, to reallocate these resources so we can achieve better results. But when it comes about this ecological crisis due to the Amazon region, which all over is talking about, including the next um, COP will be here in Belém in a couple of years. And the question is, when it comes to a no return point crisis that people are talking, specialists are talking, ecologists are talking that the Amazon deforestation is close or is coming closer to a no return point. Uh, how would the Schumpeterian theory respond to that? Because it's not a financial crisis, it's not a capitalist crisis. It can be the last crisis for the whole world, or not. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate these two questions. One on how Joseph Schumpeter would think about China, and second, what he would think about the Amazon potential. I think the best way is let's first call Joseph Schumpeter. So we call him now. How are you? Well, I have heard, now comes Joseph Schumpeter. I've heard this great question on China, and I think this gentleman made a very good point. Um, okay, that was Joseph Schumpeter. But now back to Schumpeter himself. He would certainly argue that the, over what has happened in China over the past 20, 30 years has been very much in agreement with his economic philosophy, but less with his political philosophy. So this strange combination of China on the one hand being a free market economy on the economic side, but being a dictatorial system or communist system on the other hand, that of course he would never be able to reconcile. These would be capitalism as platform for creating new ways of living and new ways of doing economics, etc. And he certainly predict that in the longer run, this model China will not be tell you, having been many times in China, I agree with you. In the longer run, there will always be too much tension. I've seen it also myself. You can talk with Chinese, a very open mind. You can talk about many things. You can criticize, but never criticize the political system. So then suddenly the discussion, and in a mature democracy, not going to work out. Now then, on the views of Schumpeter on the ecological resources, in theory, in the framing, I have tried to clarify, articulate, ecological capital is one of the five components of territorial capital. And, I insist, very important one. This is much more important for this part of the world, goes for any part of the world, but this great area, the whole part of the Amazon, Savannah part of Brazil, is critical for the ecological quality of our world. I would not say the world will be destroyed if Brazil does not have a right policy, but we are certainly aware of the fact that a couple of months ago, when the leaders from all of the Latin American countries came together in Berlin, at least they made a statement that protection of the ecological resources, and tropical rainforest, of course, is one of them, that this is absolutely critical for Latin America, but it's also critical for the rest of the world. So I was with statements, even though I still find that there could be even more rigorous statements and more rigorous policies to be adopted in the future. But it's a first step. And I think also the Brazilian president stated that he was highly respected in the rest of the world is trying to say, well, it ought to be different, could be more rigorous. And I would hope that the COP conference in, what is it, 2025 or so? Yeah, in Berlin, then would more or less, well, less what has been fact. See how, yeah, exactly. Because that is absolutely important. And do not underestimate the importance of COP conference. I've participated also in COP conference in Marrakesh, back, and get thousands of world leaders together. That is important. I could only suggest also, that's also to my friends here of the university, should try to link and liaise also with the preparation of COP conference. University, not only this university, cooperation with others, has so much to offer, but then be proactive. So that's important. Talk with policymakers in that as university. We can offer you some ideas, do some research, and these we can already put on the table. And the COP conference should also provide a platform where also people from the university give a speech, etc. tell the world what good things the university here is. That is proactive, and that's again, that would be super clear. Be proactive.
Uh, what do you think about the Pentagon model, about the ecological crisis is provoked or to mine activities in Brazil? It's very disastrous, uh, provoked about mining. What you think about the Pentagon can be a solution when the uh, uh, companies provoke uh, the disasters ecology? What do you think?
Well, I like the question also because tomorrow at the conference there will be also a colleague from Chile, Vicio Aroca, also give us, and together with him and also the others, we have done published an article recently on the mining industry, not only in Latin America and in Chile. Chile also has lots of mining industry, but also in the Netherlands. Until 40, 40 years ago, we still had a very strong mining industry. And overnight, the government decided to stop mining. For a simple reason, we found natural gas, which was seen as ecologically more friendly. And so the whole country has been living on natural gas for 40 years. Now I can tell you what's happened. The government has just decided to stop the production and distribution of natural gas almost overnight. So next year, there will not be natural gas anymore. That's a rigorous decision, especially nowadays, because we also depending on Russia for our natural gas. But nevertheless, uh, the government has decided that natural gas should also be stopped for a simple reason. It caused many earthquakes. That area with an unstable soil, etc. Several houses were destroyed. Overnight, now we don't have gas anymore, at least not from our own country. So we have first a rigorous decision, close the mines. Second, close the production of natural gas. All the sequence of years made just. We hope that we will manage it. But of course, you become very vulnerable in terms of your supplier. And we do not want to be depending on Russia anymore. So the natural response has now been that we will have a massive multi-billion investment in windmills, parks, but not only mainland, build windmills everywhere on the North Sea. The North Sea energy park, but only with windmills, huge investment. But we hope that in 10, 15, half of the energy will come from the North Sea, another type of technology, but it will happen. So Brazil government, at the end of the day, has no way out or to take a rigorous decision to make sure energy supply is sure. That means proactive thinking for solar energy, a lot of sun in Brazil, wind energy, maybe less wind, but so with creative thinking and especially where we need universities, with creative thinking of academic, possible. So I'm optimistic we find a solution everywhere. We find a solution. But the government ought to be proactive. Okay. Good. I think I've said enough. I liked it. I could continue forever, but Karima also is very also is, we have to be fair to her. Yeah? No, no, no. No. I have eaten up too much of your time. Sorry. So is that okay? Maybe a short question then, quick, and then Karima, you can already start the preparation.
Uh, can we consider resource exploration as a part of creative destruction?
I think can be a creative destruction. Um, Creative destruction, of course, often means that there is poor or so, but it can also mean that the system itself creates destructive events, and in a way, climate change is something where you might say it's partly human-made, maybe not 100%, but partly human-made. So we have created our own destruction. Again, also in that case, um, we ought to be, and that's also why I really hope that this COP conference, which will take place then in 2 years' time, um, would set the tone also for this type, not only looking fair, that is very helpful, but say, well, let's make the best out of it. Academic would say, well, of course, we need to take rigorous measures, but there ought to be creative destruction. Let's forget about certain things, but let's academics develop new concepts. I think university is the only system where it can happen. Thank you. Time. I was too much enthusiastic, and it was so nice talking to you.
Thank you very much. Ik heb het niet nodig. Okay. I know it's late, so I will keep it short. And tomorrow there's a conference, so we have more things to share. So thank you very much for being here and to share the things we are doing. But of course, we would like also to learn from you today, tomorrow. So my presentation is on dashboards. Also in his presentation, we need active governance. Not only government, but also smart intelligent governance to develop a kind of system, early warning system, not to reach that point of that the uh, shocks in the system, the disaster can affect us in a way that we reach the tipping point. So, the figure that Peter mentioned. So, how to prevent not to get into that tipping point territorial area, and to um, approve to continue that or to, as Peter mentioned, to be better. Even when there is a shock, disaster in the system, how can we cope, deal, manage with that, keep our performance in a way that we are going into a better situation? So, what we did was for these kinds of things, develop a kind of early warning system. One of the most used or developed one is the dashboard. So there is a huge, before developing a dashboard, you need to follow a few steps. Important is there's a huge interest in data analytics aspect and to understand the dynamic, but also the causality. And how do things happen? What is the cause? What is the consequences? Sometimes you have factors and indicators in the context of those disasters, shocks. Some inputs could be an input, but sometimes these inputs could also be consequences. There is always in the system an interaction between the different uh, factors. So what we thought was, if we would like to develop actionable actions, proactive, what are the most important factors we need to start with as Peter mentioned, ecological issues, or do we need to start with economic issues and to see what is then the interaction in the Pentagon model, for instance, to create or to develop and manage the maximum or to search for optimal strategies for the highest quality of life in cities, regions, etc. So what we did, based on these kinds of research and all the dynamics, this presentation I would like to give kind of example for COVID. And we all have to deal with Corona all over the world. And for instance, in the Netherlands, during the COVID, the government didn't really know what to do. Not only in the Netherlands, in Europe, outside Europe. Where to start? How to fan, create different actionable solutions to keep the system healthy. You have people, you have organizations, business. How can we deal with it? So we thought, let's start, first of all, not collecting data, because if you collect a lot of data, you will lose the focus. So we thought, let's start first with developing a kind of framework. So first, in the middle, you see Corona. eh? Okay, we could collect data on COVID infections from the hospitals, but we have also in the Netherlands that counts all the infections uh, on national. So we thought if we think about corona, we think about the virus. But during the time from end, it started in China, from China, let's say 2020, March, February, March, Italy, from Italy, to all Europe. Okay, so there are different kinds of types of COVID. And then, what does it mean? How does it spread? What is the source? So, through mind mapping, so every step you take a step in your mind. So, what if I think about COVID? Okay, there's the virus spreading. What is the source? If we want to create immunity like the Netherlands at the beginning, where to start? Do we have to start with a particular group? We have to take all the population, and at that moment we didn't have vaccination. So that means where to start again. So you have to think step by step, uh, like a decomposition approach uh, on the topic or let's say the danger of it. And then you have also the interaction. So in the Netherlands was okay, you are not allowed to go outside or this. But what is then the distance? Do we have to do 2 meters, 1 meter? What is then the effect? But you cannot measure it directly because we didn't have the data. So through the mind map, we would like to create a kind of framework to manage the situation. But as I mentioned, there was no data. Important is, do we have to look at it from the level of the city, region, or do we have to go deeper into our city system and look into neighborhoods and what is happening in all the neighborhoods? And is there a kind of interaction? So that means if you look into the city regional system, it's also important to look at the functionality. How do people move? What kind of socioeconomic activities do we have? Can we also illustrate that interaction? So I, as president of the city of Utrecht, I did neighborhood. What kind of activities do we have? So I can go to the park. If I go to the park, I can interact with others. If I have COVID, I could spread also the disease. So the interaction is very important, but also the context. Because if we look at the mind mapping, I also illustrated a kind of group. So you have younger people, elderly people. How how should we deal with that? So context is very important, and of course, data. There was no data, and if there is data, uh, in the Netherlands, for instance, there is data only on national level. So Peter and I and other colleagues, we had a big discussion on that. We also organize different workshops and special sessions how to deal with these things and how can we also create those kinds of early warning systems, or how can we help the government and policymakers to deal with this situation. So that means, as I mentioned in my mind mapping, we need to decompose, not to say, okay, COVID, this is the solution, because that's not the solution. So that means decomposition tools that we need, and also big data. And what kind of data? We have a lot of, as I mentioned, through the mind mapping, you have different kinds of relationships, interactions. And the question is where to start exactly. So the combination of decomposition and big data is very important in this. Okay. So this is I you cannot hear the movie. That's a pity. But as you see here, this is just a metaphor. You see the Colosseum, the Taj Mahal. So it's like the city. Let's take the Taj Mahal and the Colosseum as a city. So what we did and do still in this project is we blow up the city system like the Taj Mahal. So that means every unit of the Taj Mahal or Colosseum has a function, and each unit is interacting with each other to be or develop the Taj Mahal or the Colosseum. So that means the interaction and the performance of each unit is important to develop a kind of system to understand and to manage, and also to analyze the performance. So what we did in our research for COVID and other things, we built up in a mind map, let's say COVID, and then we blow it in different units that is important. And then the line between all the steps give us also an idea of what's really important, the question, and to look at the functionality and to search for that specific data. So not starting with collecting all the data, but specific data, and then we build again Corona. What we did, up is the idea, abstractive, think global. The different layers in the system are, let's say, regional, global scale, regional scale, city scale, neighborhood, street level, even individual scale. The different colors illustrates the different ideas from the perspective of ecological perspective, from economic perspective, from mobility perspective, because if I think of COVID, mobility was playing a very important role. Where do people go? How do they move? And does it cause also spreading of COVID? So top down, a bottom up idea. So first you start thinking big, you divide it into different layers, into different perspectives, and you blow it up to smaller pieces, and then to understand dynamic, the dynamic and the causality, you build again blocks. This is just an illustration, like the Pentagon model. In the middle, we want to reach the highest maximum level of health, of quality of life. What we did was, this is for Amsterdam, we blow it up into different conditions. What is really important if you think about health and healthy system, sustainable system, resilience into the system, what are the most important conditions? So that means to blow it up a little bit. What was for Amsterdam important was wealth creating potential, social aspect, ecological resilience, smart mobility. But still, we want to understand that. How can we manage that XXQ, highest quality of health, life, etc.? How can we build that resilience into the system? It means we blow up again the conditions. For wealth creating potential, for instance, you see innovation resources are very important, talent, And then for ecological resilience, for instance, smart energy system. So every time we want to understand how to maximize that particular thing in the repositioning strategy of, for instance, Amsterdam. If this is very clear, as I mentioned, is you want to manage and create an XXQ, like the Pentagon model of Peter, is we should also look at the interface. So that means how can we create efficiency in this uh, Pentagon model? So that means what we did also with the COVID is to look at the dynamic. So the dynamic means the interfaces between the conditions. For instance, we look at an example, accessibility, interact with smart energy systems. If you look at the interface, you create also a kind of dynamic. So in this case, accessibility could be a kind of input to maximize its XQ through smart energy systems. So interaction is very important. And that's what we did also for the COVID-19. As I mentioned, we developed a very clear framework for that. But the question is, how can we get to that data? Where to find the data? So there is no data set that we use. We use the combination of different data sets into a kind of system, the decision supporting tool systems such as a dashboard, to illustrate the level of the XXQ, the level of maximizing health. So you need data, of course, to create the efficiency, effectiveness for planning, management, and research. As I mentioned, you can look at it from different levels, global level. But what we did here for COVID was we look at it from district level and also street level, and in other cases, a little bit on individual level. So we used a kind of Higginson model based on space and time. So what you see, just an illustration, Higginson was the Higginson theory is more you look at the behavior of people. Why do we make some different decisions based on time and space? So this is just an illustration. What you see here under, so this is space, that is time. So you see a man and his wife and a child in the morning. 6 o'clock in the morning, they wake up. The filter is working. So you have a family, 6 o'clock, they wake up. So the husband goes to work, the wife takes the child to school, and then she goes to work. After work, she goes to the supermarket, take the bike, pick up the child, go to home, and they meet each other at 6 o'clock. This is space and this is time. So every time she makes a decision, and every time he makes a decision. So in the context of our COVID research project is every time we make a decision. And the question is, how can it help to illustrate that kind of decision, group decision, individual decision in different places to manage COVID? So what you see here is an operational corona mind map. So all the things that I have illustrated, we put it in a kind of operational, a working one, actionable. What you see here is more on the national level. This is more on, say, deconcentrated on municipality level. So if you look at the different, these are the angles are the different questions. So that means there is no one question, as I mentioned. So all the lines are different questions, research questions, knowledge questions. That means, for instance, if you look at let's say, contact patterns. That means how people are moving, or are they more working online? Do people go to work, stay at home? Are we going to the park? Are we going to family visits, etc.? So that means that you could also illustrate that. How can we create immunity? Yeah, group immunity. We need vaccinations. Not all the people are getting vaccinations. So we have to look at the willingness. How many people? Where exactly? Which city? And do we see a kind of pattern? Do we see also that people are visiting the cities? And how is then the COVID spreading situation? We have also to look at the long term because COVID, you are infected, but what does it mean in 1 year, 2 years? Because people are still have symptoms. What does it mean for the social economic performance of a city? So I just give you just a few illustration examples. So if you blow it up, so that means if we talk about coronavirus, you need to see where exactly geography, time, and also the numbers are important, spreading. Okay, this is more the external conditions, season. If it's raining, people stay at home. What is then the situation? And the environmental quality, have air quality in another neighborhood is better than the other, does it have an impact? Sometimes, sometimes these are sometimes input, could also be an output if you look at the interfaces. This and personal attributes such as health condition, income, education. What we see also, research from our colleagues in the US, you have neighborhoods with less educated people, with a different ethnic background, so they are less educated, less aware, so they go family visit, etc. So they are more affected, or low income, they have to go to work. So what does it mean for that kind of group area? Because if they have to go to work, they can be the chance is higher is they can be affected, they can go home, infect the children, children can go to school or not, play with other children, etc. So there's always a kind of relationship and interaction. So this is another example. Can go. Oh yeah, important is also the government intervention. What is then the response of the government? Does it really work if we have to wear a mask? What does it mean? And do we have? Can we create another situation? Well, as I mentioned, phase. So there are different kinds of government interfaces or response. But the what we have, see if it really works. Well, these are just some examples of operational Corona dashboard. And as I mentioned, long term, short term, how can we create kind of early warnings or really proactive solution or actions to protect people? Well, so we thought let's develop a kind of dashboard for that to help the policymakers, but also to be informative also to the people that they could see, can I really go to the park with real-time information, not information of last month because it will not help us. Also, Higginson model, how can we also influence or stimulate a kind of behavior, decision making? It's like driving a car. If you have a car without a dashboard, well, you don't know which what to do. Do we have to stop? Can we go? And how fast are we driving the car? So this is the dashboard for the car, and this dashboard has different kinds of meters. So each meter illustrates something to respond on that. And behind these meters, you have other small handles that we do not see, but it's in the car. So this is a metaphor for our dashboard. As you can see, you have a dashboard, and you have also to look at the external, your environment. And combination of a dashboard and environment, you could also copy, interact, and manage things. Like if you look at the surroundings, you see father with the child, then you stop. So this is a kind of metaphor of an early warning. So the whole idea is to give a kind of introduction of our dashboards and what is really needed and what are the principles and the conditions, and also in combination with data. How can we integrate the different data sets in these dashboards, and how can it help? But as I mentioned, the art is not collect a lot of data on COVID, but to have a kind of understanding, yeah, the knowledge questions, and then to find those specific data sets, integrate them, see how they interact. So how much data do we have? Do we need? So if you collect a lot of data, if you have hundreds of indicators or key performance indicators in your dashboard, you will lose the focus. So that's why we developed this mind map of COVID to go step by step and to pinpoint the real questions for our knowledge agenda for the COVID. As I mentioned, so you have a kind of framework of data. These are more examples of devices and program tools that you could get the data, structured data, unstructured data, and the question is, how can we transform the data into information? So the dashboard, it gives it the dashboard itself will not make that decision for all of us. The dashboard could help us to create a kind of understanding and reality to make specific decisions, to develop those kinds of proactive, actionable, smart solutions. So it will not decide for us, but it helps us to make those specific decisions that create a kind of efficiency and effect. Yeah. So these are more like the handles, the foundations and the ideas on the COVID on the dashboard. But I will not go deeper into this, but it's more a kind of to help us to understand how we are performing, like how does the city perform, how does an organization perform, etc. The founders, let's say that the fathers of this dashboard is more um, Captain Norton. They have found or developed this idea of scorecards. But at that time, they didn't have the data, so they didn't know if it was being effective. Oh, these are the principles, as I mentioned. How many KPIs or things do we need? The magical number is 7. So 7 main goals or objectives. From the objectives, you could also transform them into KPIs to go on. So before we developed this, of course, we did also literature research, a lot of things. So you have advantages and disadvantages, and so on. Has a lot of research on this. So it refers to organizational disadvantages and advantages, results, people, etc. And based on it, we could construct the handles, the pillars of the dashboard. So a lot of organizations, a lot of governments, cities are using dashboards, but it's more with 2, 3 KPIs. There is no alignment. So what they measure, they really do not really what they measure. They do not really illustrate the right performance. So as I mentioned, the dashboard helps us to monitor, measure, uh, give you kind of understanding of a health check for smart cities, but for also healthful cities, creative cities, sustainable cities, and for COVID, etc. So before we thought let's develop further the dashboard, this is just an architect of the dashboard of our government. developed by our health organization, the Dutch Health Organization. What they have in the dashboard was more the information on infections, hospital admissions, ICU admissions, the COVID death. That was KPIs that they are using to make decisions for the whole country. So they didn't really know what to do. So this is what they had, and that was it. And every time they had to make other decisions, apologize, other decisions, apologize. It didn't really help. So we thought, let's extend it because we need more information to make the right decision and to keep the system healthy. So we extended the dashboard with policy stringency. So if there is a kind of a policy response, what does it mean and how can we illustrate it? Because policy decisions or response was taken on national level. So in the Netherlands, we didn't have municipalities. They took their own decision or develop a kind of strategy. And then we also integrated social interactions, social distance. So that means we need also data on the mobility of people. So if I talk about mobility, then with our mind mapping means what does it mean mobility? So that means people, there are different categories of mobility that people um, use. As I mentioned, mobility to go to work, mobility to go to park, family visits. And what does it illustrate then if we have that data? And then the vaccination. So the vaccination came later, and we could also, let's say, collect the data or receive the data, and we could also integrate it in our dashboard. Okay. So the architect of the dashboard, COVID-19, consists of vaccination program, policy stringency. And the policy stringency index was developed by the Oxford Group. And the policy stringency index contains, let's say, three, four categories. And each category was measured with, let's say, in total of more than 70 indicators that illustrate the policy response of the government. So if you have closed schools, shops, wearing masks, having distance, so it was all measured on national level, but we could get the data. So this is just an illustration. This is just a screenshot of our dashboard. So if you go now, then you can play with it. So what you see here is the total number of cases, death, hospitalization, ICU admission, vaccination. So the total, this was a screenshot of February. And then you have information of today, cases, the death, hospital, etc. But we could also illustrate it the whole week. So it was really up to date and real-time information. This is just an illustration on national level. But what we did was we also create a kind of alignment of risks for the Netherlands. This was developed also by the Health Institute in the Netherlands, but we connected also with our dashboard. So that means you have different layers. This was okay, the country is safe. If you go on this level, that means okay, we can still deal with the current strategy. If we are here, that means it's a serious situation. That means again another government response. But the government didn't have information on municipality level, so they had to come again with a kind of response to see what will happen with the risk level related to infections to the general dashboard. And this is only on national level. So what we thought was, if the government say, okay, we are near into a very serious situation, that means red color, what should we do? Should we implement a full lockdown? That means shut down the whole country, each municipality, even when we have municipalities that are doing very well in the red zone, in the green zone. So we thought, let's develop COVID decentralizes that we could illustrate the situation of each municipality. So that means we could help the government not to implement a full lockdown, but to deal with municipalities that have a serious problem. Yeah. So this is just an illustration still on national level. If you can also create this in the dashboard, you see the dynamic, the interface, the interaction between the different KPIs. So that means just an illustration. You see uh, the time, you see the different KPIs like hospital admissions, you see the disease and the total. But the question is, what does it mean, this dynamic? How can we understand that in the dashboard? And how can we deal with this, such as the government, to come up with a real effective response? Okay. And then, as I mentioned, if you have more information, does it really help us to come up with that response, an effective one? If we have also data on vaccinations, policy stringency, and the mobility. So this is just an illustration of different types of vaccines that we introduced. We have availability, but also acceptance rate. If people do not accept it, what does it mean then? What is then the situation for each municipality, not on national level? So this is just an illustration for you. So world in data, you could get data for each vaccination, compare for instance, Netherlands with Europe or the whole world. But what, what we thought was, okay, we know the Netherlands, we know the world, but what does it mean for our municipalities? We don't want to have another lockdown. So we thought let's go deeper and develop further the dashboard for all the municipalities. As I mentioned, the policy stringency, there are three categories developed by the Oxford Group. So you can, for instance, the government response, if we have the use of masks and could integrate it in our system and dashboard. What does it mean? Does it is it a kind of input for spreading COVID? Do we reduce it or nothing happens? Okay. So as I mentioned, so the data is available for that moment. So policy stringency, we could also integrate that in our dashboard, and then again the dynamics. So that means, what does it mean here? Does it mean that the government introduced uh, masks? So that means that closing schools, there is an interaction. It has an effect on that. So we can open our schools again. Yes or no? And then what we did also with the dashboard, you can even compare the dynamics. So you have, for instance, just an example, policy stringency compared to the number of cases. So if we have here this combination, so we want to understand the dynamics. So does it mean that first we say, okay, we close restaurants, so that it has an impact on the number of cases, or was it more that it was already a kind of um, a change in number of cases? So policy transition didn't have really an effect. So those questions were really important for us to understand. Okay. And then we thought, because the government didn't have the mobility data, so we searched further and we found that Google Mobility Report was available. So Google, the group, collected all the data on the mobility based on different categories. So, so the category retail and recreation, pharmacy, parks. So this data illustrates, it was for the Netherlands and it was on national level. So you see time, and this was for the Netherlands. And then you see the different categories. And the question was also, hmm, so these are the activities, but does it mean that here in this period, you see that a lot of people go to park? Is there a kind of relationship with policy response? So that means we integrate this data in our dashboard to see the interaction between mobility and policy. So does it mean that if we have a full lockdown, that people are more have more time to go to parks? And if they go to parks, does it mean that they can affect each other? So what we did was we wanted to know what is happening in what is happening in the country, in the system. So we developed, we integrate like the Hagerstand model, time, space, so the geographical scale. So what you see here, province, this is an example, Limburg, choose a municipality, Heerlen, for instance, and it was the situation from Heerlen. So that means that a full lockdown was not necessary for Heerlen. So if the government shuts down the whole country, including Heerlen, it is a, how do you say that, lost for economic performance. So that means they had to lock, so the restaurants and the organization had to close the doors. That means people could not go and shop, and it's a big loss for the entrepreneurs over there, for instance. So with this dashboard, you could also provide this kind of information that the government could say, okay, Heerlen, we don't implement full lockdown in Heerlen, only in Amsterdam, for instance, and in Utrecht, because there is a high risk of infection. You see? So based on the different skills, you could also provide the right information to make the right decision. So this, this was our work, and it was also useful for the government to make those kinds of decisions. Yeah. And if you put the different KPIs, as I mentioned, so the mobility, this is just an illustration. We go to the next one, as I mentioned. So the mobility data was not only on national level, we could also via Google report, we could also extract information on the municipality and follow the patterns of people. People make decision or not. And then based on that, you could see also the interaction with the infections, hospital admissions, and the mobility people, and the policy response. With the dashboard, you can also create maps, and you can see what is happening in the country. Yeah. And it's an interactive map based on time and space. And you can follow here what is happening. So I could say, I will avoid Amsterdam. I will not go to Amsterdam because it's dangerous. But it gives me also information. So we didn't only develop this for policymakers, but for all the people. And we received very good information because it was really simple to follow. What we are doing now is, if you put all the indicators together, this is just an illustration of mobility, stringency, cases, and vaccination. And what we want to do is to develop a kind of econometric model and to see what is that, what is really to understand the dynamics, what is then the input and output here? Is it more stringency, or was it more that people stopped going to parks or going to family that really had an effect on cases? So that's where we are at the moment. And it's very hard because you have different kinds of periods, you have different kinds of municipalities and external conditions. Is it winter? Is it summer? So we had to deal with the COVID in different seasons. So one, we saw when it was raining, for instance, it played a very important role on the cases. You do not see it here, but we did that integrated that indicator. And rain was very important. Okay? But to develop this dashboard, you need a lot of things, of course. Uh, you need different kinds of programs, different kinds of data sets, and yeah, to create a kind of architecture to integrate different data sets on different levels, but also from different perspectives. Yeah. So we developed the dashboard. What I have presented was more for the COVID, but we developed the dashboard for different kinds of cities. What you see here, we went to Atacama in Chile, and in the desert above 5,000 sea level. So what they have is more than 60 huge telescopes, and they are measuring, monitoring the performance of stars. And each telescope is measuring more than, let's say, 70 KPIs, and these KPIs are aligned with the general mind mapping, with the general idea of how to keep the stars alive, for instance. So what you see is, so all the telescopes are measuring apart, and more than 60 countries are working together, so they know who is accountable for what. So all the data is collected, transformed to supercomputers bigger than this room. The supercomputer is transforming the data towards the dashboard. So this is the general dashboard, like our dashboard. And then here you have indicators, you have here the sub indicators, and it's also related to a risk level. If one of the indicators is red, so they know exactly which telescope is illustrating that error and who is responsible. So they can go to that kind of specific satellite telescope, and they can also see how to solve it. And all the indicators are aligned, and they also illustrate the total performance. So, and then, as I mentioned, so these are the different indicators. And based on this, all the knowledge questions, you can create different kinds of econometric model. So there is not one model that gives you an answer. It depends from which context, what is the research question, which level. These are some questions that we are working on. As I mentioned, we are dealing with different space, time, levels, but also different KPIs. Are we really have identified the right indicator? Do we have the right data? And we are still struggling with that. And my question to you is such a kind of mind map exercise meaningful to develop a kind of new research agenda, develop or extend our models? Because not one model gives you one specific question, but we also do a kind of multi-level modeling or extending our models. Depends also on what is really the question. Because if you're just focusing on one thing, like the urban piazza, if you just only focus on ecological issues, or like Peter illustrated in the Pentagon model, if you handle it or manage it in an isolated way, you lose the focus on the whole system. So important is to look at the interface. Also in the models that we are working with, if you focus on ecological models, issues, it's also important to look what is well, what do they do in other models? Can we combine them? Yeah, okay. So if you would like to play a little bit with the dashboards, you can go on this website. And of course, uh, after 20 now and December 2020, beginning of 2023, nobody was talking about COVID in the Netherlands. So the government stopped collecting data on infection. So you still can play with the dashboard, But there is no up-to-date data after December 2022. Okay. Questions, examples, ideas? Oh,
First of all, thanks for the presentation, Professor Karima. It's a really great opportunity to see such rich and complex system, a well thought system, at such a high level of detail. And my question is about that. It's about detail. As you mentioned, the mind mapping is a tool that we use in the early stages of the research to assess the general situation. And am I right? Uh, uh, so, yes.
so what you see is that a lot of cities and organizations, because we did it also for organizations, is they are measuring things that are really not articulated, identified, or mentioned in the strategies. So there is no really an alignment. So first, like if you have a kind of vision, a strategy, first of all, you need to break it down. Huh? And then you need to find the important units, important KPIs that are really related on what you really would like to achieve. That's the situation you have. And then you are measuring the current situation and to see how big is the gap. Okay? So, as Peter mentioned, you would like to create a kind of early warning system and to be resilient or to reactivate all the active and also reactivate, repositioning the functions of the different elements in our system. Another question?
Uh, it's just the question actually comes now. Uh, are there other tools besides or complementary tools to the mind mapping that we can use in research to, as I said, not lose focus? How do we make sure that our system, it was one of the last questions, are we measuring the right things? How do we make sure that we are measuring the right things? And how can we do that with tools complementary to the mind mapping? To not maybe, I'm sorry, to not maybe achieve a high level of decomposition in detail and maybe lose focus of the right uh, path or the right data. How to make sure that we are measuring the important things.
Very good. So I also illustrate the risk level. Yeah? This is just for COVID. For instance, like Stockholm. Stockholm, we did also this develop a kind of dashboard. Stockholm want to be the best in being sustainable city. Yeah? First, we wanted to understand what does Stockholm means with sustainable city, because there is no one framework of sustainable city. Then, together with a lot of actors, stakeholders in Stockholm, we blow up the let's say the concept of sustainable city. They could identify the conditions to be sustainable. But what does each condition means? How can we measure them? And then you break it down into very clear metrics. But next to that, you also formulate target settings. So that means within 1 year or 2 years, we need to achieve this and this and this. By monitoring, analyzing, and related to a kind of risk level, you can see if they achieve their objective or condition. If not, if they are still performing the same, that means we miss something. That means we have to come together again, or to see what is wrong, or reformulate it. That means we are measuring or doing things that is not improving our performance to be sustainable, stay sustainable. And of course, there are different kinds of methods. Mind mapping is just one of the approaches. But with a decomposition approach, you have different kinds of approaches, tools that you could implement or use to mind map the concept.
Well, I would also like to thank for this interesting presentation, and my question is very short. How difficult was for the national government of the Netherlands to implement this kind of a national policy to face the corona effects? I mean, and how useful can it be to build a collective or international response to a crisis like the corona crisis in Europe, for example? I mean, what were the main difficulties for the Dutch government to implement these um, policies? And how useful can the mind map be to build a collective and international response for big crises like the corona? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. Well, if you have to manage the situation based on 3 or 4 indicators, will not help. So that means that what we saw, not only in the Netherlands, all Europe, every time the policymakers or decision makers had to take every 2, 3 days a new decision based on 2, 3 indicators. But what was important is to extend it to have more information, but the data was missing. For instance, as I illustrated, like how do people move? Or what can we do? How do in the system the municipalities doing? So our government didn't have that information. So it was very easy, full lockdown, not in the Netherlands, whole Europe, also outside Europe. If and we had a lot of financial issues then. If you close a restaurant, what does it mean? A lot of restaurants were bankrupt, also shops. That means they cannot sell, people not go and buy things. Saved a lot of money, but that it was a bad situation. But what we did was we could illustrate if you monitor, have the right information, real-time information, then you can make other decisions. But not only decisions, but you have to also to analyze the decision you make. Does it make sense? There was also a situation that people could not visit family. I could not visit my parents. But does it was it effective for spreading or how do you say reduce the infection? They didn't know. They didn't measure. They didn't have the data. If you have this kind of information, you can call it a dashboard, supporting tool, etc. You can even do it, let's say, on an Excel sheet, like a scorecard. But then you have that kind of information to make the right decision, and then you should follow the decision. Does it have an impact? But how long? Is it an impact for 2 weeks, or is it just for one day? That that information they didn't have. It will make sense. It makes sense if you have this kind of information. What will you do? Would you say still lockdown, full lockdown, or would you say, okay, let's have an effective way of managing? Yes, depends on the functionality of the activities in different municipalities. Uh, Well, when it started in, let's say, November, December, but we thought, oh, it happened far away, it doesn't matter. But if we have followed the movements, because in February, March, it was a ski holiday, a lot of people were skiing, also people from China, of course. And then, for example, people from the Netherlands went back in March, back home, and we have in Den Bosch, we have Carnaval in Den Bosch. It was in March. The people came from Italy, went back to the Netherlands, gathered for the carnival, and for us, the COVID uh, outbreak, it started in Den Bosch. See? If they had that kind of information, it's a different story. But for us, it was a panic situation because a lot of people were infected, get ill. And then you have a pressure in the health system. Hospitals were full, but they didn't have the information on hospital admissions fee. So that means they couldn't manage spread the ill people, the people that were sick to hospitality because they didn't come, they didn't have that kind of information, or they didn't share that kind of information. Okay. Other questions? How was the experience here in Brazil? How was the situation in Brazil?
Terrible. It's die almost 1 million persons, and the government is uh, falo legal, deny the problem and uh, by the vaccine. The, it, yeah, nobody have information. Nobody have information, and information uh, uh, fake news is very lot, and i- it's the chaos, and it was terrible.
For us was in the Netherlands, the government dashboard, but it was just a few indicators, and people didn't understand why the government said you have to wear a mask to create distance. So people didn't understand that, and then we thought let's work on this. Everybody was using the dashboard. Peter, did I forget something?
A few observations. See, exposed. Life is very easy. Now we know all the pedal, the curves, etc. We know everything. If you are a government, if you're beginning, you do not know there might be a vaccine that has made a big difference. But if you don't know it at the beginning, then the task of the government is under high degrees of uncertainty, which is normal business, one might say. But this is about human life, much more complicated. So all governments have taken risk. We have had presidents in some countries who said, well, it hardly exists, like Trump, liberal policy. Still, as we know, others have been very strict, like like in France or Spain, etc. Because you're playing with human lives. Nowadays, I think looking back is easy. Looking forward is more difficult. One thing we know, there will be a virus in the air and there will be virus, etc. No question. Like any catastrophe or like a flood or an earthquake, there will be an earthquake. Which one exactly? The intensity, we don't know. We have to not only empirical data, but what is the structure of information, proper decision. Governments also, all countries nowadays, committees, they judge exactly what happened. Did the government take a risk hurt or big? And so Swedish government was very liberal. Spanish government very. At the end of the day, ought to look into what was most effective. All decision making and so what we now see, so that you would know if a new virus will come up, to have the information architecture in place. And that is important. I give one simple example. Hospitals. They, in many cases, hospitals don't have sufficient all the patients. York, we have seen television, etc. What is hospital? Is the number of nurses sometimes, yes, as it intensive care units. So if you have no idea what is hotel capacity indicated, cost, if it ever happens, then what? Look into these critical immediately start on the weaker points which over the past years. Hospital nurses and the beds one personnel would also COVID. 25% of your personnel also has COVID, so you have to reduce capacity estimate for the infection of personnel. Gradually, I think, in order to have a good vaccination, we were very lucky by in time. Vaccines have been developed well. 'Advances in medical that would not have happened in the past centuries. There was no vaccine. Millions of people things. But we have, I'm afraid we have not yet. Now we try to forget about it. And think in terms of possible solutions if it ever happen again, and it will happen again. What? And we don't know why. Science.
The President Bolsonaro, la- loud here, left, and it's very.
One question.
Just complementing the commentary about Brazil. As I said, it was a great opportunity to see such a high level system and highly detailed. Uh, in contrast to what has been done in Brazil, or to what hasn't been done in Brazil, because it seemed like here the federal government was actually working against itself, against working against the population, actively misleading and misinforming people. And to see such a beautiful work, such rich research work, uh, actually gives me hope as a future researcher to maybe work on something as good or as important as this. So maybe in the future try to help uh, the country in a way that hasn't been done in the past. So thanks again for the presentation.
Thank you very much. And of course, this is not done in one day. This is teamwork. So we have been working on this with many people, Sweden, Turkey, Belgium, from the Netherlands, and all over. And through organizing special sessions and workshops, our colleagues from the US, China, whatever, and together, uh, mind mapping, we said, oh, this, oh, we didn't talk about that. So we started small, and step by step, it's getting bigger, bigger. It's all based on team. So we hope to work with.
Thank you, todos. Obrigada a todos. Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much, Professor. And foi muito bom estar aqui. E amanhã, não esqueçam, estaremos lá no nosso encontro. De manhã serão as sessões paralelas e, por favor, quem irá trabalhar na na no credenciamento, por favor, cheguem cedo, porque, tem gente que está no hotel. A maioria das pessoas estão hospedadas no hotel, estão nas sessões paralelas. Então, vai estar, assim, vão querer fazer o credenciamento 7 horas da manhã, né. Então, por favor, quem vai estar no credenciamento, cheguem cedo. Thank you so much. Thank you.